this is what they were constantly talking about, that we need a new way of being modern and we cannot imitate the West. And they could also see, because they were very well-traveled people, they could also see that in the West itself, that process had not led to happiness or stability, that the West had many achievements. It had mass education, cheap consumer goods, it had a popular press, it had mass entertainment, and yet there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of rootlessness. And this is something they suspected for their own societies. And I think one of our tasks today, when we think about making a difference, is to recover some of their thoughts, some of their criticisms, and to see what relevance they have for us today. Their basic idea that the meaning and the purpose of human life does not lie in the acquisition of goods, that industrialization or individual self-interest cannot be the one-size-fits-all solution to all the manifold problems of the human condition. And they drew upon philosophical traditions in Buddhism, in Confucianism, in Hinduism, to develop a whole set of ideas about how we can be modern with each other. And they also invoke solidarity with each other, people in India, people in China. And today, this is what this gathering reminds me of. A world of cosmopolitan exchanges across national borders. People come together to discuss their shared challenges and their dilemmas. And I think there is a special urgency to this today, because a way of life has become so commonplace. A way of life built upon competitive individualism is sought after everywhere in Asia. Most children don't have childhoods anymore. We are busy building up our portfolios from the age of 12 and 13. We are competing with our peers in this great race for fame and money and success. We are all entrepreneurs from the time we are children. In the realm of ideas, there are very few alternatives left to Western ways of organizing society, politics. Everything, everywhere you look, the institutions, ideologies of the West, whether it's the nation state or free market capitalism or Google, they cover the surface of the earth today. And the strange thing is that these ideas are not imposed by force alone. There's a whole process of seduction that happens, and people themselves in Asia are willing to be seduced. Today, as we speak, several generations of Asian elites, ruling elites, have been trained in American and European universities. They come back, they have the same ideas about how to modernize their respective societies. They know very little of their own traditions, of their own philosophies and literatures. But when you look at the ideas that they're importing into Asia, and where are they importing from? The West itself. And we look at what is happening in the West today. In what way, again, what people were suspecting and fearing back in the early 19th century has come to pass, where capitalism, a kind of competitive ideology of competitive individualism, has not led to prosperity for all. This is something you see now in practically every Western country, where there is great inequality, unemployment growing all the time, nobody knows how to create new jobs, mobile corporations continually moving from one country to another in search of cheap labor, low tax regimes, high profits, draining investment in their welfare systems at home. You see what's happening in Spain with young students rising in protest, massive unemployment there. Greece is in chaos. France, Italy, again, political dysfunction. Large parts of America and Europe confront deindustrialization, public debts, deficits, environmental pollution, and a general loss of faith, the most important thing, a general loss of faith in the political and economic model that was supposed to bring prosperity and stability for all. Towards the end of 2013, Barack Obama, the president of the world's richest country, said that inequality is a defining challenge of our time. The Pope who heads the most conservative global institution in the world today, the Vatican, he denounced the deified free market. He said masses of people today find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Many people are turning against established political parties, or many are turning to extremist parties. So you have parties now rising all across Europe who deal in hate. Hate against the Jews, hate against Muslims, hate against immigrants, against gypsies. So Europe and America can no longer provide, at this point at least, models for us to be. When you look at Asia, the picture is actually much, much more mixed. We see in Japan, which experienced great growth for several decades, and then for the last 2 decades, it has experienced more or less zero growth. They were great innovators of technology, and now they face a set of problems to which there are no solutions. Depopulation, shrinking labor force, a lot of women being forced into the sex industry, homelessness, rapid aging. The statistics are depressing. Suicide, depression, rising domestic violence. At least the unrest in Japan comes at the end of a long cycle of growth. In places like India and China, with their 2 billion plus populations, the cycle had barely begun. It had only been around for 2 decades before it began to splutter. So secure and dignified life, which is the aspiration for all of us who are aspiring to be modern, seems more and more remote. A tiny minority, as has happened in Europe and elsewhere, has basically taken the major share of economic growth, of the profits generated by it, and there's growing social unrest. In both countries, the Chinese leaders themselves acknowledge that their economy, as Wen Jiabao put it, unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. We had thought that democracy would march step in step with economic growth everywhere. But democracy everywhere, you look at Thailand, you look at Greece, is undermined by a form of economic growth that privileges private wealth creation above the general welfare of the majority. So fascists, extremists, they're all on the rise also across Asia. You see demagogues in Thailand, you see demagogues in India today. But I think there are also very positive things to be noticed here. You look at Indonesia, where a small town mayor who helped the urban poor, who helped street vendors, who helped them against big corporations, has become the most popular politician in India today. You have all kinds of social movements and agitations in India today. People living in villages who don't want their forests, who don't want their mountains to be mined. They want to live their environmentally sustainable lives that they've been living for centuries and centuries. And when you look afar, you look outside of Asia, you look at Latin America, again, the kind of social movements that have emerged. There's students in Chile being supported by professionals, by doctors, by engineers on the streets, hundreds of thousands of people pouring out. In Bolivia, you have someone from an indigenous community, member of a coca farmers union. He's the president today. In Uruguay, there's a former guerrilla fighter who was in prison for 14 years. He's the president now. He's not only against consumption-led growth, he wants free education for children. He has legalized same-sex marriage. He's legalized marijuana. And I think it's very clear that this whole model, as one of the great Indonesian thinkers that we should recover, Sojatmoko, put it, that this Western history of modernization is only one possible course open to us. And the concept of modernization we need now, which many of these social movements are showing, does not have to emphasize competition. It has to emphasize cooperation, a concept of development that does not aim at affluence, but at sufficiency, and a conception of individual rights and ownership that is limited by the public good. Even in Japan, you see new developments in this time that it has suffered zero growth, where the population, the rest of the world's population is still exploding, and many Japanese are coming to see the limits of their resources. They don't need to be number one in the way they used to aspire to back in the 80s. This is the time to learn about the environment, to learn about organic farming. There's a new maturity. And I think we should all be aspiring, the people like us, who are still aspiring to be modern, still aspiring to catch up with the West, with this kind of maturity, a way of being modern that avoids the mistakes that the West made, that Japan made. We should never forget that this transition to affluence and stability that a small number of countries in the West reached was achieved at a great cost in suffering, great cost in violence, imperial conquest, ethnic cleansing, many minor, 2 major world wars. Asia is now rising, and we need to avoid those kinds of conflicts, those kinds of wars over resources, over territories. Certainly the hope that fuels our economic models today, that billions of Indians and Chinese consumers will enjoy the same lifestyle enjoyed by a few 100 million Europeans and Americans, is a totally dangerous and absurd fantasy. This fantasy really condemns the environment to destruction. So peace in the century really depends on Asia, on us, all of us here, finding a different way of being modern, of making a difference. And when I stand here and I look at you, I know it can be done. We can make a difference. Let's start now. Thank you.